My stepfather and mother sold my house while I was on a business trip. At 29, returned home to find a sold sign planted on my lawn and my life's work missing. What ensued was the most surgical revenge that any financial analyst could conceive of. I'm an investment consultant in PHX, doing it for around 7 years. I'm way good with money, like really, really good. My colleagues tease me that I have a sixth sense for financial bullshit, which is ironic given what transpired. Until I was 12, I grew up with a single mom, and she married Frank, my stepfather. Everything about Frank screamed success: a real estate investor, stock market player, new car, fancy watch. I never really trusted him. There's just something unsettling about a guy who has to make sure everyone knows how much money he has. But he made my mom happy, so I didn't say anything. In hindsight, it was so many red flags. The way he would evade questions about his business. How he'd always pay for expensive dinners with a different credit card. Those mysterious phone calls he would take in another room. But my mom was happier than I'd ever known her to be, and I was preoccupied with my own life. College applications, then college, then graduate school, and my new job. I busted my ass to get through college and grad school, got a great job, and bought a nice house in a nice neighborhood when I was 26. It wasn't a big deal, but it was mine, you know? A 3-bedroom Spanish style with a little backyard where I could grill on weekends and a spare room that I turned into a home office. I paid the down payment out of my money, but my mom insisted on co-signing because it would help with the interest rate since she and Frank have such great credit. At the time, I didn't think much of it, only that I was grateful for the help. I'd worked 2 jobs throughout college, saved every penny, lived with 3 roommates in a shithole of an apartment just to scrape together that down payment. It was the culmination of everything I had worked for. Fast forward to 3 months ago. I had just returned from a 3-week business trip to New York, which I took to aid a significant client in reorganizing their portfolio post-merger. The work was intense, 14-hour days, constant meetings, not much time to sleep. I was tired and jet-lagged, and all I wanted to do was faceplant on my own bed. I parked in my driveway at 9:30 p.m. and froze, because there was a fucking for sale sign in my yard with a sold sticker slapped across it. I thought it was a mistake. Had to be. Perhaps the real estate agent placed it in the wrong yard? My head was spinning for any answer other than the one staring me in the face. I sprinted to the front door and thankfully my key still worked. I burst through the door and found Frank packing my stuff into boxes. My framed diplomas. My book collection. My kitchen equipment. Everything, just mixed and put into haphazard boxes like garbage. When I asked what the hell was happening, Frank hardly looked up. He acted surprised that I had come back early, as if that was the problem here. Even my voice sounded weird to me, tight, high with panic. I asked what the for sale sign meant, practically trembling. The room was spinning all around me. Frank actually laughed, saying it was no longer my house anyway. They sold it and got $40,000 over asking price because the market was hot. He threw one of my engineering textbooks, the one I'd hung on to since college, into a box labeled donate, and I wanted to punch him. I feel like I blacked out for a second, because the next thing I remember is standing 2 inches away from his face, shouting that he couldn't sell my house without my permission. Frank just did that smug smirk I've always hated, the one where he acts like he knows something you don't. He matter-of-factly said they were legally permitted to sell it because my mother's name was on the deed as well. They had not only refinanced the mortgage, but also taken out a home equity line of credit in the past month. Apparently, I don't need that much space anyway, according to him. What did one man need 3 bedrooms for? I didn't know what I was hearing. Refinanced and a home equity line of credit? Last month, when I was hustling in New York, when I asked where Mom was, Frank said she was in Barcelona already, then off to Paris next week, and maybe the Greek islands. When he responded to say they weren't using MY money, he corrected himself. It was family money, as he considered it. He said they'd already found me a nice little 1-bedroom condo downtown that was more my speed and would be closer to work. I called my mom immediately. No answer. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. Frank told me she was enjoying their vacation in Europe, which could be billed to MY House Bank. They'd set aside $30,000 from my $380,000 equity in my house for me to get a little apartment, he said. Like I should be thankful for the crumbs. The $380,000 included my initial down payment of $95,000, 3 years of mortgage payments, and the significant appreciation of the property value in our hot market. I was in shock, could not literally process what was going on. Frank had informed me that I had until the end of the week to remove my essentials from the premise before they took possession. He told me to stay in a hotel for a few days, as though I was a disruption to his greater purpose, as if I hadn't just had my whole life ripped out from beneath me. I walked out as if I was in a daze, checked into a local Holiday Inn, and sat on the edge of the bed staring at the wall. How could they do this? How was this even possible? I tried to call my mom 20 times that night. She eventually responded at about 3 a.m., midday Europe. My mom says I'm too dramatic. It was a house, she said. I was young and didn't require all that space. They found me a good price and would help me track down a lovely little condo. Her voice was a little slurred, day drinking on my dollar, apparently. I can't believe they said that. I told her it was my house that I bought and paid for. I wore my ass off working 2 jobs for the down payment. She argued that technically they were the ones who helped me buy it since her name was also on the paperwork. Frank said it was a seller's market, making it the prudent financial decision. And then she had the nerve to tell me I've always been uptight about money and needed to loosen up and enjoy life a little. Uptight about money. Those words hit me like a truck. I had been frugal my whole life because my mom was a single parent and I'd seen her struggle. I had gone without so many things growing up for her not to have to work a 3rd job. And now she was referring to me as uptight. When I inquired about my $95,000 down payment and the 3 years of mortgage payments, she dismissed it. We would talk about that when they returned, she said. Frank was taking care of it all. I should just take their word for it, because Frank knew what he was doing. He had a fantastic investment opportunity waiting. I disconnected the call and hurled my phone against the wall. Trust them? Trust them? The telephone ricocheted off the hotel room wall and skidded under the desk. I was breathing hard, sitting there, trying to think through the haze of rage and betrayal. A few minutes later, I paused to take 3 breaths, then grabbed my phone. It wasn't broken, and devised a plan. I know finance. I understand legal documents. If Frank wanted to play this little game, he'd chosen the wrong person to fuck with. I barely slept that night. My brain was racing, putting together snippets and threads of conversations over the years, little things Frank said or did that now took on new meaning. How he used to ask me about my finances, just making conversation. How he had offered to look over my investments last Christmas. How he joked about my mom being on all my accounts in case something happened to me. It had all appeared so innocent back then. The following morning, I called in sick to work, then drove myself to my bank. I wanted to check whether any huge deposits had been made. Nothing. I looked into my investment accounts. Nothing unusual there either. I checked my credit report and nearly vomited when I saw it. 3 new credit cards in my name, all maxed out. A personal loan for $120,000. A $200,000 home equity line of credit against my house. A loan for a car I'd never even viewed. All within the last month. All with digital signatures of my signature that I never signed. That's over $675,000 in new debt, all in my name. My own family had identity theft me. By those who should have loved me, protected me. I sat in the bank parking lot for nearly an hour, trying to breathe. I felt like I was drowning. It was no longer just about my home. It was my whole financial future being devastated. My credit had fallen from near perfect to the low 500s. Soon debt collectors would be calling. But I risked losing my security clearance at work. My career could be over. That's when I called Uncle Sam, my mom's brother, a retired Marine who never cared much for Frank. He was the kind of dude to have contacts everywhere from his military days. Lives in Scottsdale in a small house with his German Shepherd. He had almost come to blows with Frank at Thanksgiving 2 years ago when Frank said something about military spending. When I told him what was happening, he went leaden silent, then simply said he was coming. 6 hours later, Uncle Sam showed up outside my hotel room door with a manila envelope stuffed with papers. It turns out, he had been following Frank for years, suspicious of his business ventures. Frank had a past. His name was something else at the time, but the same old scams. He had been investigated twice for investment fraud, but charges were dropped each time a key witness suddenly changed his story. When Uncle Sam had memorized financial records from their home while he was visiting for Christmas last year, said his gut told him something wasn't right. Uncle Sam with brutal candor told me Frank was broke. 2 years earlier, his real estate investments had tanked when he had gotten involved in that condo development scam in Tucson. He'd been maintaining the appearance of a millionaire with credit card debt and small-time Ponzi schemes, using money from new investors to pay returns to earlier ones. My home was his final big asset to sell. I examined the documents, credit reports, bank statements, investment prospectuses making ludicrous promises of returns. There were notes from earlier investigations, news clippings about failed projects with Frank, under his old name, involved. When I asked him why he hadn't told me sooner, Uncle Sam looked pained. He'd attempted to warn my mom repeatedly, but she had tuned him out. She accused him of harboring jealousy toward Frank's success. And he didn't have hard evidence at the time, only suspicions. He became worried that I'd blame him for his paranoia if the wild card wasn't true, and I appeared so happy in my new job and house. The next week was a blur of action. I filed a report with the police for identity theft. I contacted my company's legal department, thanked the law for good benefits. I put fraud alerts on the credit bureaus. I documented everything. With a little help from Uncle Sam, I found Frank's pattern. He'd forged my signature on a number of documents, the refinancing, the credit applications, the whole bit. He must have rehearsed for months to get it right. We discovered that he had been tracking my mail and using my personal information for months, perhaps years. Most damning of all, he'd used my social security number to apply for those loans. And, being a family member, he knew all the answers to my security questions, my first pet, my mother's maiden name, where I attended high school. Each new discovery was another gut punch to the gut. This was not opportunistic. This was calculated, planned destruction of my financial life. A friend from work, Natalie, emerged as my unlikely, but best ever, partner in crime for the whole ordeal. She is an expert in fraud detection and assisted me in putting together a bulletproof case. She stayed late after work helping me organize documents, draw timelines, and understand the legal implications. Over sad microwave burritos in the office break room, she explained this wasn't routine identity theft. Beyond that, this was bank fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion, serious federal crimes. Natalie made me see that Frank wasn't only going after me in his recent slew of muggings. There were strange discrepancies in my tax returns from 2 years ago, small enough that I hadn't noticed, but just big enough to raise a flag now that we were looking. Frank had been laying the groundwork for this for years, gradually gaining access, testing boundaries, exploring what he could get away with. I found out that Frank had been evading taxes for years, laundering income in offshore accounts while running up debts in other people's names, mine included, but also the name of several elderly investors who put their trust in him. He and my mom were planning to enjoy their European vacation for a few weeks, then return to tie up loose ends before leaving the country for good. The Barcelona trip was only the first stop in what would become a permanent relocation once all the assets were liquidated. They had already researched and purchased one-way tickets for their final departure after this brief return. A former Uncle Sam buddy turned banker discovered Frank had been doing research on countries with no extradition agreements with the U.S. Panama, Montenegro, the UAE. He had been asking questions about requirements for long-term residency. This was more than a scam. This was a plan for escape. With each new revelation, my anger chilled. This was not a spur-of-the-moment betrayal. This was years of calculation. My own mother and the man she married were conspiring to obliterate my financial future, steal everything I had worked for, and abscond with the money. I could have gone in immediately and confronted them, but Uncle Sam had a better plan. Maybe you let them come back, let them think they've won, and then you spring the trap. So I waited. I pretended to be defeated on the phone with my mom. I moved out of my house per instructions, stored most of my stuff, taking only what would fit in my crappy temporary apartment. I said that I was coming to terms with the situation. I even expressed gratitude for the $30,000 they generously gave me from my own house. I played the hurt but ultimately forgiving son. On our final call before they returned home, I told my mom that maybe I had overspent on the house, and this could be a blessing in disguise. She loved that, told me how mature I was being, how it would teach me valuable financial lessons. It was almost physically painful, the irony. All the while, the legal machinery was beginning to grind into motion. During the 2 weeks they were in Europe, I worked almost nonstop with my connections and Uncle Sam's contacts to build an airtight case. I collaborated with the police on the identity theft charges, the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit for the interstate wire fraud, the IRS for tax evasion, and 3 different banks to document every fraudulent transaction. Natalie built a case so comprehensive that there would be no loopholes for Frank to exploit. Uncle Sam's military connections helped expedite processes that would normally take months. Frank and my mother came back 2 weeks later, brown and cheerful. They brought me a pathetic souvenir from Barcelona, a cheesy refrigerator magnet, and took me to dinner as if nothing was wrong. Frank described the great investment opportunity he was working on with my portion of the house money, some cryptocurrency and South American mining interests. His eyes glinted with the same phony ebullience he'd always had when talking about his deals. Turns out Frank said he could do it, give my 30K into 300K in a year. Best returns you won't get anywhere else. I'd be thanking him when I was purchasing an even bigger home next year, he said. I smiled and nodded and asked all the right questions. How did the investment work? Who were the principals? What was the announcement timeline? Each response became more vague than the last, full of jargon and name-dropping but lacking any substance. Classic Frank. My mother was clasping my hand across the table, telling me how proud she was that I was being so reasonable. She had purchased new jewelry while overseas. I knew it was new because the tennis bracelet she was wearing cost more than most people's monthly salary. My salary. Soon you will meet someone special again, and then you will be excited for a fresh start in a stranger place, she told me. Sometimes the universe has plans for us that we don't understand until later, she said. I smiled until my face hurt. The following day, their accounts were frozen. All of them. The IRS does not fool around with tax evasion. Fraud investigations had been opened by 3 credit card companies and 2 banks. The attorney who handled the real estate closing was cooperating with authorities in connection with the forged documents. Their passports had been flagged at all borders and airports. Frank called me in a panic around noon asking what the hell was happening with their accounts and whether mine was frozen as well. His voice had that false concern, as if he cared about me when he was trying to see if he was the only target. I told him, very calmly, that no, it was only his and Mom's accounts that were frozen and that he'd best call his bank. I was in Natalie's work office on speakerphone. She gave me a thumbs up. Frank paused for a long while before asking what I did. His voice, too, had gone entirely. Gone was the false joviality. This was Frank the way he was now, cold, calculating, angry. I told him I hadn't done anything. He brought this on himself when he stole my identity and forged my signature on a loan document. Oh, and when he sold my house against my wishes. Frank tried to argue that everything was legal because my mother co-signed everything, but there was fear seeping into his voice now. I reminded him that co-signing does not mean she is allowed to refinance without me knowing, and that does not give him the right to open credit cards in my name, or take out personal loans, or buy a BMW I've never even seen. That's what he tried to say, family financial decisions, but I interrupted him. I told him the FBI doesn't believe they were family financial decisions. Neither does the IRS, or the 3 banks that are probing him for fraud. It was then that Frank began threatening me, telling me that I was ungrateful, that I had betrayed my mother, that I was ruining the family. Then the real threat started, that he knew people who could make problems go away, that I had no clue who I was dealing with. I just sat and listened until he ran out of steam. I wondered if my mom was there with him. When he blurted that she was, I asked him to put her on speaker. Then I heard my mom's voice, and something broke in me. She sounded little and confused, not like the assertive woman who had been lecturing me about financial responsibility just days before. She asked why I was doing this to them. I asked if she was aware that Frank had loaded me up with debts that exceeded $675,000. If she found out he forged my signature. If she knew of the credit cards, the loans, the line of credit against my house. I didn't need to hear her respond. I told her I had trusted her. What happened was I trusted her, and she co-signed my house. And she betrayed me. Both of them did. After a long silence, my mom said they were going to pay it back. Frank attempted to chime in that it was all lies, but there was no conviction in his voice. I told him that I knew exactly who I was dealing with. I summarized his background, how John Franklin Weiss, born in Tucson, had filed for bankruptcy in 2006 after his first investment scheme failed, how he adopted the name Frank Wesley in 2007, how he was investigated for fraud in 2010 and 2015, but charges were dismissed when witnesses spectacularly recanted. I said I could go on, describing the offshore accounts or the false tax returns. I could hear glass breaking on the phone. Frank was losing it. I said he had 2 choices: surrender, cooperate with investigators, and hope for leniency, or escape, and compound his problems, and my mom's. He hung up. I knew without a doubt which option he would choose. 3 hours later, my mother called me crying. Frank had emptied her jeweler box and vanished. Stole her car too, the Lexus they bought with my money. I expected that, but she was blindsided. She kept saying that he said he would fix everything. He said that he knew people at the bank. It was simply a misunderstanding, he said. I had to explain that it was not a misunderstanding. It was fraud. It was identity theft. It was criminal. She shrieked that he had promised, that he told us the South American deal was going to make us all rich. I had to inform her there was no South American deal. There never was. It was just another scam like all his other scams. When she asked what she was supposed to do now, she sounded small, childlike. For the first time in my life, I felt like the parent in our dynamic. I told her that she needed to cooperate with the authorities and tell them all she knew. Perhaps they'd go easy on her in exchange for his whereabouts. She confirmed he said he would call her when he was somewhere safe, which sank my heart yet further. I told him that he couldn't fix this. No one could. I'd filed charges. Now the FBI was involved because he had crossed state lines. This was federal wire fraud. She pleaded with me to cancel the charges, that I was splitting the family in two. I almost laughed. I said that she tore this family apart when she chose him over me, when she assisted him in stealing my house, when she stood by as he trashed my credit and put me into debt. I reminded her I was her son. She was supposed to be someone I could trust. She wept, pleading that she was my mother, as if that made everything right. As if the martial bond between us were unidirectional, my obligation to forgive her, but no such obligation for her to protect me. And that's why this hurts so much, I told her. 2 days later, Frank was arrested at the Mexican border. His passport had been flagged by my uncle's contacts. He had emptied out a storage locker with $43,000 in cash and my mother's jewelry, which he was going to sell. They were rewarded with phony IDs, multiple phones, and evidence of other victims, elderly folks he'd preyed upon, convincing them to invest in non-existent businesses, other relatives he'd swindled. I was no one special, just his latest and most ambitious target. What followed was a nightmare of litigation, forensic accountants, and endless meetings with investigators. I needed to take time off from work, which meant finding a way to explain to my boss why I needed the time. Fortunately, he was pretty understanding. It turned out his brother had experienced something similar, with an ex-wife. My house sale was canceled because of forged documentation, but it was too late to get it back that was for sale. The buyers had rights too. They were an older couple who had sold their previous house and had no other place to go. They were victims in this too, and I couldn't fight them. Months of legal battles ensued, and ultimately I got a settlement that compensated most of my losses, but my credit will take years to recover. For the worst of it, Uncle Sam let me stay with him. We'd never been especially close before. He was the gruff, slightly scary uncle who mailed cards with $20 bills when I was a kid. But he supported me throughout the ordeal. He showed up for every meeting, read every document, and on the really bad days, he'd just sit next to me on his back porch, drinking beer in silence while the sun went down over the desert. As for Frank, he's doing 12 years for fraud, identity theft, and tax evasion. It turned out he had done this before 3 times, but never on this scale. The prosecutor described it as one of the most callous cases of familial financial exploitation she had ever seen. My mother filed for divorce, but our relationship is irreparable. She still claims she had no idea of the full extent of his schemes, that she was a victim also. Perhaps that's even true to some degree. The investigators discovered evidence Frank had been hiding things from her. But she knew enough. She helped him. She benefited from it. She wore the jewelry and took the vacations and spent the money. And when presented with the truth, her first instinct was to defend him, not me. Some betrayals are simply too much to recover from. Sometimes she emails me, says she's in therapy now, says she's sorry, claims she didn't know what she was doing. Each message lingers in my inbox, unanswered. I'm not ready to forgive her. I don't know if I'll ever be. My only real family now is Uncle Sam. He helped me locate a new apartment, co-signed my lease because my credit was ruined. Not once did he tell me, I told you so, even though he had every reason to. Natalie from work and I began dating about a month once everything calmed down. Apparently nearly being financially ruined really helps bond two people together. It was your board of directors, of sorts, she said. She witnessed me at my most vulnerable there. Weeping in the office bathroom, hyperventilating before meetings with federal agents, stress-eating vending machine snacks at midnight as we pored over the documentation. And somehow she still believes I'm worth keeping around. It is the only bright spot in the entire mess. I'm renting a nice place now and gradually rebuilding my credit and my life. The debt has been wiped from my reports, but the damage lingers. I've become paranoid about my personal information, changed all my passwords, security questions, even got a P.O. box for my mail. For example, I regularly check my credit report, typically on a weekly basis. Some cuts are permanent and shape the way you navigate the world. I wonder if I did the right thing sometimes. Maybe I could have found a way to deal with it privately without involving my mom. There are nights when I lie awake thinking about her alone in the tiny apartment where she can barely make the rent now, and her friends disappeared because they were really Frank's friends and her reputation smoldering in tatters. Then I think about the look on Frank's face every time he thought he was the smartest guy in the room. How they were planning to leave me drowning in debt while they founded a new life with my money. The funny thing is that Frank never gave me credit because he thought I was just a numbers guy. Matt, boring and predictable, who does spreadsheets and investment portfolios. He never suspected that being good with numbers also meant I could trace his paper trail. He never believed that I could summon the courage to take him down. Ultimately, that's where he went wrong the most. Sometimes I consider going to visit him in prison, just to ask him, why? Why me? Why a stepson? Was it merely a matter of opportunity, or something more personal imbued in it? But I am aware that no answer he might provide would render it sensible. Some people just take because they can, because they think they deserve to have whatever they want no matter who gets hurt. Frank had been a con man for his entire life, but this was certainly his last con. And if there's any justice in the world, he will spend every one of those 12 years remembering he was finally out-conned by the stepson he believed to be too dull to have a cause for action. To those asking if there's a lesson here, there is. Trust is a must, but verification is a need. Even with family. Especially with family. Review your credit reports often. Be cautious about who you add to your accounts, even as co-signers. And if something doesn't feel right in your gut, listen to it. I overlooked too many red flags because I did not want to believe the worst of people I cared about.